I was recently looking through old issues of Cosmopolitan magazine from some were in the 20s, they were really damn old, but most of the ones I want to focus on in this video were from the 60s to the 80s. And Cosmopolitan's interesting because it's always been a little controversial. It's always kind of pushed the boundaries, right? Hasn't it, babe? Yes. And I thought that by looking at a magazine like this that was kind of aimed at the average everyday woman, it would give us real insight into what a lot of the attitudes around food, body, sex, relationships, femininity, work, education, views into what all of that was like at the time for the average American or English woman. I think most of the issues I looked at were the UK versions. But yeah, it was just really, really fascinating. Now, what's really interesting is that there were things in these magazines that would be considered really controversial today. So, for example, there was this story from 1962 about how useful fasting is for weight loss. Okay, why are you anxious? Now, this, of course, is incredibly dangerous, with the article saying things like, you can eat to your stomach's content, but after you feast, make sure you fast for 1, 2, or even 10 days straight. After the first day, you don't even feel the hunger pangs. Literally encouraging an eating disorder. So damn dangerous. Or there was this article where actors give their dieting advice, including, every girl has to worry about her figure. I do a series of pushbacks. I push back from the dinner table before it's too late. I have a rather unique diet. I can eat anything I want, I just don't swallow it. Nowadays, my only problem is getting enough energy to keep me going through my hectic and demanding schedule. I live on vitamins, yeast tablets, plus occasional glasses of tiger's milk. Bikinis are a girl's best friend. I wear one as often as possible. Then if I look down and see my stomach sticking out, I immediately pull it in. Another trick is to not put on much weight when you're pregnant. It's too hard to lose. This is scary, this is dangerous. But this was just the norm at the time, and it was just published so freely without consequence because everyone thought like this. And it was a cyclical thing, People thought like this, and then it got published, and people read about it, and then more people thought like this, and, it just got worse and worse. But it wasn't just dangerous dieting advice either. It was really interesting to see the changing attitudes towards relationships over the decades. This article from 1962 was shocking just because it suggested that some couples out there were cohabiting before getting married, and Cosmopolitan were like, whoa, this is immoral. Can you believe people are doing this? Seriously, Cosmopolitan called it a disturbing trend and warned that religious leaders point out that trial marriages violate Judeo-Christian traditions and are immoral, inhuman, and ineffective. This was also the same year they published the article that says, I was raising a homosexual child. What mistakes do parents make that can turn their children into abnormal men and women? Doctors now assume that most homosexuals are born with the capacity to be normal. They may turn to homosexuality out of fear and inhibition of normal sexual expression. And obviously this is shocking to us today, but like I say, it was normal at the time. But isn't it funny that we're like, oh my god, can you believe they were saying this in the 60s? But then this is also exactly the stuff we literally just heard on the Whatever podcast, so they're living in the past. Not in a good way either. So this was the 60s. They were still quite conservative, and Cosmopolitan were controversial for the time, but still conservative by today's standards. However, over the years, like I say, they did start to get more and more progressive. So in 1972, moving forward a decade, they published an article normalising abortion and sharing women's stories of needing abortions and suggesting that abortion just be less stigmatised and easier to get on the NHS. And this was huge for the time. To have something like this in a mainstream magazine, amazing, revolutionary. At this point, abortion had only been legal in the UK for around 4 years anyway. So to have something like this that normalised the procedure so much published in a mainstream magazine for women was huge. Sorry, Kubi is not happy with me filming today. She's a little grumpy guts, bless her. So in December of the same year, 1972, they published a humorous short list pointing out the double standards between men and women in relationships, and how women can actually flip it and start doing the things that men do. It was meant to be funny, it was meant to be silly, but also genuinely pointing out the double standard. So it had things like telling women to ask him if he's seen the missing button from your shirt just as he's rushing off to work. Invite some colleagues to dinner and let him prepare the meal so that you can talk office politics. Tell him, "You're very clever. You think like a woman." I love this. Very funny. I'll put the whole screenshots on screen if you want to pause and have a read, because you'll get a good giggle out of it. Also, in the 70s, there was a little piece titled "Should Men Do Women's Work?", where a whole bunch of famous men were interviewed, and their answers really showed what a range of different opinions there were about this kind of thing at the time. So you had things like, "Housework is absolutely boring, tedious, but essential. It's unkind to fob her off with an excuse for not helping. That's pure laziness. Everyone should muck in." Everyone should muck in. Versus, "Absolutely not. I'd never help, and I wouldn't expect her to do my work either." Another example. "The idea of a man not helping revolts me. You should do things together." But also, "Certainly not. Men should give their orders in firm, clear, but kindly tones." So there were clearly changes happening, changes being made, but it was still in its infancy. You still had some people with the kind of older, more conservative values, and some people more progressive. And magazines like Cosmopolitan were like, well, what do this massive range of men think? Let's show both ends of the spectrum, you know? Then, at the start of the 80s, Cosmopolitan ran a bunch of polls of their readers and asked their public their opinions on things like relationships, sex, work, whatever. And I couldn't find the entire article, but I did find a segment of the bit where they basically were asking people about their opinions about sex. And they found that most women in the start of the 80s, so this was end of 79, 1980-ish, most women believed a woman should be as sexually experienced as a man before settling down, but half of men disagree. Their study found 64% of women aged 16 to 24 approved of women being sexually experienced before marriage, and the figure rose to nearly 3/4 among women over 25. But only half of the men aged 16 to 24 approved of a woman having equal sexual experience, with that figure rising to 60% for other men, as in over 25. It goes on to say, only just over half of men agree that a woman needs early sexual experience, and almost a third of younger men actually disagree, while 18% weren't sure about it. Does this mean that half the younger male population, aged 16 to 24, still want to marry virgins? Apparently so. And then they actually quoted some people who gave the answers. One male student said, "I'd like to marry a virgin, but I know I won't. I can't help it. I think it must be the way I was brought up, but I would prefer my wife to be a virgin. I'm not, but I would like her to be. I just would not like the idea of marrying a second-hand woman." I know. Oof. As they got older, however, men become keener on the idea of women being experienced. 60% of men over 25 approved of women having varied sexual experience before marriage, which may be the result of a realism gained from experience. Another question found that people thought women should be free to take the same sexual initiatives as men. Their study found that over half of all people questioned, including men and women, thought that women should be free to make the first move. 58% of women and 65% of men. This seems, they wrote, to represent quite a major shift of opinion from the old idea that women should confine themselves to a passive role in the sex game, and it's interesting that men are in the vanguard of this revolution. So, should women be pleased by this, or is it just that men are getting lazy? Or dare we suggest, a bit frightened by the new breed of women? Women like a 21-year-old beautician who said, "I do take the sexual initiative. I'm not blatant about it, but I always return signals if I'm interested." So again, this showed a massive shift from the 60s, and it's damn fascinating. The 80s, or 1980 in particular, was also the year they started calling out what they called sexist chat. Phrases like, and so basically this is, again, the double standard around language used to describe women and men for the same behaviour. So they were saying, we need to stop saying, "He's a confirmed bachelor, she sleeps around. He really has a way with women, she's a tart. He looks casual, she looks a mess. He's persistent, she nags. He's under a lot of pressure, she can't cope." Which honestly is stuff we still need to call out today. Isn't it crazy that in, 45 years since the 80s, that makes me feel old. In 45 years, things haven't really changed that much. It's like we had a pretty rapid period of growth and change between the 60s and the 80s. And then between the 80s and now, we definitely went forward a bit for a while, and now it's kind of not just stagnating, but rolling back a bit, you know? Things really stepped up in 1986 as Cosmopolitan published an article about how and why we should all become more familiar with our vulvas, or at least people with vulvas should become more familiar with them, and another article on why smart girls carry condoms. It's crazy, but isn't this such a big progressive shift in content and attitudes in just 20 years? This is why it's so fascinating to look at, because it really does tell you so much. Of course, even in the 80s, there were some attitudes that were a little bit more conservative or outright harmful in some ways. There was this article about apparently what men want in women versus what women want in men, and they said that most sought by men in their perfect women were the following attributes: physical attractiveness, ability in bed, warmth and affection, social skill, homemaking ability, dress sense, sensitivity to others' needs, good taste, moral perception, artistic creativity. The attributes most sought by women in a man were these: a record of achievement, leadership qualities, skill at his job, earnings potential, a sense of humour, intellectual ability, attentiveness, common sense, athletic ability, and good abstract reasoning. So, still a little bit of stereotypical sexism from both sides there, let's be honest. The article went on to describe the perfect woman, saying, another truth is that unless you are actively trying to please men, you are seen as unfeminine, which is also what we see today, isn't it? Right? Men dream, fantasize about the ideal feminine woman. Curiously enough, she looks a lot like the heroine in a Mills and Boon novel. All too often, she has long blonde hair and definitely needs a man to depend upon for support and protection. Well, maybe deep down she doesn't, but in male eyes, she looks as though she does. She is the woman, according to the media, many powerful and rich men who certainly don't need working wives seem to marry. She's the fairy princess. On the topic of career women, what men apparently said were, and here's some quotes: who wants to come home tired out at the end of the day and have to start some intellectual discussion with a career woman about her day? You have to be tough to get where she's got. Who wants to live with a tough woman? She's so into her career, it's obvious she couldn't possibly have time to spare for a man. You can't have two stars in a family, and my job is very important to me. Her career is so obviously a substitute for having a man and a child in her life. She has everything. She doesn't need a man. Can you imagine two of us with demanding jobs and schedules? I need someone restful. It's quite funny to read in some ways, because, like, at first I read this, I'm like, oh my god, can you imagine living in that world? But then I'm like, hang on a minute, this is exactly what the men on the Whatever podcast are saying, and other men like that. I'm like, we kind of are still living in that world in some ways, and it's a little bit terrifying how far backwards we've gone, isn't it? Anyway, sorry, I know this was a bit of an aside, but I just thought it would be interesting to take a look at what the average young women were being told, and what the average young women and men's attitudes were at the time, as told through an average magazine. You know what I mean? I thought looking at the actual 60s, 70s, 80s opinions and views, and, you know, what was being put in the media would be interesting here, because it's one thing to be like, oh yes, here's a summary of what people thought, and it's just kind of off the top of your head like they did on the Whatever podcast, but it's another to be like, no, you know what, let's actually take a look at some of the material and find out what real people were saying.